Do you have any optimism about these negotiations?
I have zero optimism. I think there is no reason at all to think that these negotiations are going to produce a real peace. If you look at Russia's demands, which have been clearly laid out many, many times, and you recognize that these are basically non negotiable demands, at least a handful of them are, and we know them well. They're non-negotiable. And then you look at what the European/Ukrainian position is on these demands. They are polar opposites. There's no overlap. The Europeans and the Ukrainians are completely at odds in terms of their demands with Russia's demands. So I don't see how you can even come close to having some sort of agreement. I don't think maybe you can point to any of Russia's major demands where the Europeans have caved in. Uh, the Europeans and the Ukrainians both still want Ukraine to have a security guarantee. And from a Russian point of view, this is unacceptable because it is just another way of putting Ukraine inside of NATO. It's de facto NATO membership. The Russians do not want the United States giving Ukraine an Article 5 security guarantee. But that's what the Ukrainians want, and that's what the Europeans want. With regard to territory, the Russians have made it manifestly clear, again on countless occasions, that they want all of the territory in those four oblasts that they have annexed. As best I can tell, the Ukrainians and the Europeans won't even agree to give the Russians full control over those two oblasts in the Donbass, much less all four uh, oblasts. On territory, there's just no sign of meaningful agreement. And with regard to the size of the Ukrainian army that would exist in any peace agreement, the two sides are light years apart. Uh, the, the Europeans and the Ukrainians are talking about a Ukrainian military that has somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000 men in it. At the Istanbul negotiations back in 2022, the Russians were insisting on a Ukrainian army that had about 85,000 soldiers. So when you contrast 85,000 with 600,000 to 800,000 soldiers, you see the two sides are light years apart. Has there been any movement, any sign of a compromise on this issue? No. Has there been any sign of a compromise on the territorial issue? No. Has there been any sign of a compromise on the issue of a security guarantee? No. So what is all this talk about getting some sort of meaningful agreement? This is all, as I like to say, a giant kabuki dance. There's just no there. And nevertheless, just to take this a step further, the Ukrainians and the Europeans continue to talk about a ceasefire. And even occasionally, the Americans talk about a ceasefire. The Russians have again made it unequivocally clear there will be no ceasefire. And in fact, when Trump met with Putin in Anchorage last summer, Trump came out of the meeting saying the whole subject of a ceasefire was off the table because Putin had made it clear to him there was going to be no ceasefire, that this war was going to be settled one way or another on the battlefield. And Trump said that. He recognized it at the time. But with the passage of time, he's back to occasionally talking about ceasefires. And the Europeans and the Ukrainians much more frequently talk about ceasefire. But it's not going to happen. This one's going to be settled on the battlefield. There's eventually going to be, I think, an armistice because one side or the other will prevail. And that's just another way of saying it'll be settled on the battlefield. But it's not going to be settled in diplomatic negotiations in Abu Dhabi or in Istanbul or in Moscow. This is not going to happen, at least based on everything we've seen up to now.
Yeah, I find it's very strange, a lot of the rhetoric around, especially when the Europeans are calling for this compromise, because the compromise they could have gotten was pretty good back in 2022, but they waited 4 years, a long time, and they still expect the parties to somehow meet in the middle and come to an agreement. Even more than this, they want the Russians to make the greatest concessions, it seems. And the kind of concession they want, essentially, the reason why the Russians went into Ukraine to prevent the victory, or sorry, prevent NATO from embedding itself into Ukraine, in essentially in a peace agreement, which, after a Russian victory, it appears that the Europeans want what the Russians went to war to prevent, which is European and NATO troops within Ukraine. And also, it baffles me a bit, though, this very normative language they have, because they make the point, well, Ukraine can't make the greatest concession. It's not fair because Russia's the aggressor, Ukraine is the victim. So they won't even talk about security guarantees for Russia, as there's no recognition of the security competition. It's just goodies and baddies, an aggressor and a victim. And so the Russian seems to speak in the language of power. That is, we have won. We get to dictate the terms, while the Europeans are speaking this normative language. But that's not fair because you're the aggressor. It's very strange to watch. It's like they're not speaking the same diplomatic language. Sorry.
Yeah, if I can just jump in, Glenn, I actually have an explanation for that. I'm not saying it's the correct explanation, but it's just how I think about this issue. I think that the vast majority of people in the foreign policy elite in Europe, and this is true even in the United States, because I think Trump is something of an anomaly, they all believe that Ukraine in NATO is not an existential threat to Russia. They believe that what is going on here is that Putin is an imperialist and he's trying to create a greater Russia. Yes, it matters for security, but there's a deeper cause at play here. It's just that imperial gene that all Russian or Soviet leaders have. And Putin is particularly aggressive. And this is nothing to do with NATO expansion. How could anybody possibly believe that a benign alliance like NATO, and again, this is where you see the rhetoric about us being the good guys that you were just talking about. How could a benign alliance like NATO possibly be seen by any Russian leader as a mortal threat? That's our worldview here in the West. There are, of course, people like you and I and a handful of others who don't accept that argument, but we're in the minority. Then on the Russian side, they have made it manifestly clear over the years that Ukraine in NATO is an existential threat. It is, from their perspective, an existential threat. And once you understand that they see what's going on in Ukraine as a threat to their survival, again, whether we in the West like that argument or not, there's an abundance. Let me change my rhetoric. There is a superabundance of evidence that they see what's going on in Ukraine, and especially with the Europeans and the Americans backing the Ukrainians, as a mortal threat, as an existential threat. And that's why they are unwilling to make any meaningful compromises. And in fact, as you well know, Glenn, if anything, the situation from their perspective gives them great incentives to take even more territory than they have already taken, to annex more oblasts, to go to greater lengths to wreck Ukraine, to really turn it into a dysfunctional rump state, to poison relations inside of Europe, to poison relations across the Atlantic between the United States on one side and Europe on the other side. Again, once you understand that the Russians see this not as a case of imperialism, but as a case of an existential threat, it looks very different. But we refuse, we in the West, and this, of course, doesn't include us. I want to be clear on that. But people in the West, people in the foreign policy establishments in European countries and in the United States, for the most part, refuse to accept that Russia's got a legitimate point of view, that the Russians actually see things this way. And that's what I think accounts for the fact that the two sides are so far apart. And furthermore, it explains why people in the West are so baffled that the Russians won't make any concessions. They should make concessions, we think. But that's because the picture we have in our head of how the Russians are thinking is simply wrong.